I will go ahead and call this meeting to order. Today is a regular meeting of the Town of Scarborough Finance Committee. Today is Tuesday, June 21st, 2022, and it is 4 o'clock. Could I have the attendance, please?
Counselor Anderson.
Here.
Counselor Seither.
Here.
Counselor Johnson.
Here.
Great. Hi, Ken.
Hi.
Item number 3 is approval of the minutes from the May 10th, 2022 meeting. Do I have a motion?
So moved. Second.
Any discussion? Okay, all those in favor? Oh, we can't because Ken's remote. Can you call it, please? Go ahead.
Yes. Counselor Johnson.
Yes.
Counselor Anderson.
Yes.
Counselor Seither.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you. Item 4 today, we have 2 major topics for discussion for today's meeting. The first of which is audit services, and the second will be a discussion of our charter revisions, which is kind of a kickover from the full council meeting last Wednesday. So for the first part of our conversation regarding audit services, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tom.
Thank you. The Finance Committee may recall our current auditor, who's been with us, I believe, this is their 7th year running. The council, through its Finance Committee, agreed to extend them 1 more year. So they've kind of completed that service, knowing that those services ended this year. First of the year, we did go out through a formal RFP process. Unfortunately, that initial process only yielded 1 applicant, one firm. And we really wanted to make sure that we fully explored what our options were. So we went back out a second time and thankfully had 2 others submit. So there was a total of 3 responses. I provided in your packet a copy of the one we recommend that the council consider. That's Markham Accountants and Advisors. I will say through the interview process, Council Chair Clucci did participate in the interviews, and as did John. Thank you. It's been a while. It's been months, I think, since we did that. And frankly, this has been kind of stuck between staff and Markham in terms of preparing a so-called letter of engagement, which is also included here as well. If it should give you comfort, we have had the town attorney review this and provide input, which has been incorporated as well. So though it's billed as a discussion item, I think it would be appropriate and probably well accepted from the town council, because it is the council's full appointment, that this committee make some recommendation in that regard, if you'd consider that. Liam, did I miss anything?
I do not believe so, no.
And just from what I recall from the conversation, when John and I participated in the interviews, we did meet afterwards and we did talk, and it included the finance team, Tom, myself. I can't remember, Liam, if you were there, but I think it was unanimous after participating in those interviews that Markham was the clear choice from the applicants. So, and I remember at the time I had suggested for them to just come forward and provide a recommendation to, I thought it would have been fine to come directly to the council, but coming to finance, I think, is a fine path as well. And so I'm super supportive of this particular vendor coming forward from what I can recall from those conversations.
Thank you, Councillor. That's correct. We also had Kate Bolton from the school. They're involved in this as well. And I believe Kate concurred with that recommendation as well.
Okay, so at this time, I'll take a motion to recommend to the full council.
I move that we recommend Markham as our new auditor going forward.
Do I have a second?
I second that.
Okay, is there any discussion? Ken, do you have any questions?
No, actually, Markham equates to me like the old time Big Six, Ernst and Whitney, Anderson. They're very well known, so I think it's a great selection. So I support this.
Yeah, one of the things I've heard, and I think this was maybe the issue with our last auditor when they came to present the findings, was a lot of the smaller accounting firms are getting out of the local business because the margins just aren't there, which kind of limit our options really to have to go to one of these big national firms. But again, they with them bring a lot of expertise. So I think it's, even though I think we all would have liked to have seen, potentially a local firm be able to deliver the scope of what we needed, I think this is the best value for what we can get. So I'm supportive of it.
And I should mention, they also have a Portland office, which we found is
Mhm.
attractive. Not that all the auditors will be from that
Yeah.
Portland office, but having that more local connection gave us some comfort.
Good. And I'm pleased to hear that Kate Bolton is also supportive of this
Yes.
recommendation. I mean, as we know, the school department works
Mhm.
as closely with the auditors as the town, so.
Mhm. Yep.
Okay, I think with that, are ready to call the vote. Colette, please.
Counselor Anderson,
Yes.
Counselor Johnson,
Yes.
Counselor Scyther,
Yes,
motion passes.
great. Thank you, everybody. Our next set of agenda items deals with potential charter revisions. As a refresher, we discussed a large packet of potential charter revisions at a workshop last Wednesday as a full council. And the outcome of that was a recommendation that some of those recommendations be moved to the Finance Committee for a little bit more in-depth discussion. It gave us an opportunity I invited Nick McGee here as in his role as Charter Commission Chair, so that we could maybe get some further discussion around some of these items. There are 4 in total, so we will just go ahead and start with 502-1-1, and if we could get that up on the screen, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, luckily, all the issues are contained on really 2 pages, so we actually provided you the text. And I think it's maybe helpful to see those provisions in a bit of context. The council, when you've seen in the past, is 1 slide, and you don't really know what comes before it and after it. So this is not in full context, but at least you get a flavor of the other elements and part of this section 502. We did also supply the committee with some of the detailed notes, and to Nick's credit as chair of that group, they took copious notes and kept very good records. So that hopefully will provide some insight as to the impetus for many of these suggestions and some of the conversation and the ultimate votes as well.
So specifically 502.1.1 is a recommendation that we incorporate a list of our physical assets. And I think that was partially what the council got hung up on Wednesday night, was just what that would look like, what exactly we were charging the town manager with in terms of compiling something like that. And just making sure that if we were going to go ahead and make a revision to the charter, that the language really speaks to the recommendation of the committee, and that we don't get too far from what the intent of the committee was during their discussions.
So for this first one, one of the things I looked at prior to this meeting was our town financial reports,
Mhm.
just to kind of get a sense of how we account for capital assets in there, which I think doesn't necessarily get to what's described here, but I'm just curious, is there, just when I looked at I'm looking at our deputy finance director, when I was looking at it, I'm assuming there's got to be a simple way to show the itemized list of all of those assets, and then some other financial metrics that indicate maybe the intent of this, and I just don't know if, as it was written.
Yeah,
if-
that would
if
be
you don't
great
mind.
if you wanted to come.
You didn't think you were gonna get called on, did you?
I was sitting back to read them.
Yeah.
Hi, Christy Bradbury, Deputy Finance Director. I actually had some questions on this. I'm able to supply you the fixed asset listing.
Mhm.
Normally, it's a once a year. It's called GASB 34, introduced it, Government Accounting Standards Board. We can keep track of it. It will be a lot of work. It's a lot of work anyway. But normally we go through this process once a year just for the audit. But if it's the committee and the council's wish for us to do it on a monthly basis, then we can do that.
So I think this was relative to the submission of the budget. And so maybe the
Yeah.
question is would that annual submission meet the intent of this if we just
Yeah.
included a little bit more?
Like a detailed listing as of June 30th? Or Because we'll do it as of June 30th, or we can put it into a monthly process if that's what you would like us to do.
Chrissy, maybe it'd be helpful just to, what does GASB 34 require? Is it just a list with, what does the actual asset listing include for
GASB
information?
34, you are required to have a capital asset policy, which the town of Scarborough is $5,000 or above.
Okay,
So anything purchased by the town is in our computer system. But normally this time of the year, we're reaching out to the department saying, this is what we have. Do you agree? Is this finished? The standard is basically a requirement for the financial statements for us to keep track of them and report them annually.
but the information contained on the fixed asset is, it's like year, make, model,
VIN number.
VIN number, and then value?
Yep.
Okay, does it speak to anything, just looking at the actual language, does it actually include any assessment of the condition of
We
those assets?
currently do not assess the value. If the town wanted to trade a vehicle in, then that would have an accounting function, but as far as I know, we don't go look at the actual asset.
Christie, do we depreciate those assets?
Yep, it depends. Some vehicles are 10 years. It is in the policy. Unfortunately, I don't have it with me, but I can certainly
Mhm.
give it to all of you and let you know infrastructure's a different life, buildings have a different life. It spells it all out on how we do depreciate the assets. We use straight line depreciation.
Yeah, I feel like that's even come up a couple times when we go through the budget process, Tom. I
Mhm.
think it's always been a little unclear to me how like some vehicles or some pieces of equipment have different replacement.
There are some
Yeah.
differences among,
Yeah.
depending on the type of vehicle. And that's based on our experience of wear and longevity and maintenance. The general rule is we try to turn these vehicles back out while they still have some trade-in value and before they start to cost us money. But there is a variation depending on fire vehicles as opposed to public works and so on.
Mhm.
Christie, off the top of your head, how many items are on that list of fixed asset to the nearest 100?
We're at thousands, we're in the
Thousands.
thousands, because what the town decided to do was to be proactive. So you are allowed to take a group of assets that may be $500 a piece. Computers, good example for the school. We combine those. We have a separate listing, but we count those as fixed assets. I don't know the exact number, but I can certainly get it to you if that's something you'd like.
My
to
only
see.
point is, it's extensive.
Yes.
And it includes everything, including roads, streets and sidewalks to, what you'd expect, buildings and rolling stock equipment, so on
The
and
new
so forth.
streetlights.
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
So just overall, I think the intent of not just 50211 and the first part of 50212, and like my line of work, we call it a reserve analysis. You take your largest assets and you try to figure out how much remaining life is on them. And what it helps you do is prepare budgeting, understanding the actual overall view of where your expenses may come from over an extended amount of time, whether it's 5, 10, or 30-year period. So something like this, I don't think the people on this committee were concerned about, a $500 power tool as much as they were talking about your buildings, your vehicles, or things like that, and having that broader. And I think the council is within its purview to say, what we really want to see is items that cost more than $20,000 a piece. I don't think anyone wants to get down to drill bits and things like that. So.
And that would be easy to produce if you guys wanted, if you set a threshold, we could certainly do that.
Is there a certain threshold that you would recommend, or from your experience, is 20,000?
Different ballgame.
What
Do condos.
median value of our town
Yeah.
assets is.
We
Yeah.
lack fire trucks in my industry. So but I think that's the idea, which is get a good grip of everything that really could be an expense down the road. And what it does is it helps you during your budgeting process. What is it you anticipate now? And then what do you really need to be planning for in the future? So.
Mhm.
And if I can ask a question of you, what I'm used to is, I'm just gonna give you an example. We would take we would call them major capital assets, say over $50,000, and say in 2020, this will need to be replaced. And you put everything out for 10 years, and then you can look at 2025 and say, that's too much money in 1 year. So I'm guessing that's
that's-
what you're trying to get at?
That's what I think the intent of the committee
Okay.
was, whether we wordsmithed it kind of clunkily, that's on us. But Right, not considering the small stuff.
Right.
Small, quote unquote, 50,000 might be a reasonable level. I think that's a worthy, if you pursue any type of change like this, I think that's a separate discussion worthy of the council. What is our threshold for visibility? What is it we really want to see?
And I think that this is exactly kind of what I was getting to was I want to make sure that we are actually incorporating the intent of the charter committee. And I think it kind of breaks down into some key voter categories too, in terms of what typically comes to, the kinds of items that we see come to referendum, I think are probably, the kinds of things that people are looking to have inventoried. And so I think a threshold is a great idea. I wouldn't even begin to guess what an appropriate threshold is, so I would definitely take a recommendation on that. But I think that coming back and saying that having that be part of our budget, our annual budget process is in line with what they're asking for, I think.
Is to your point about the tenure though, is 5 years long enough, or should we be looking for 10-year, or what, given the depreciation schedule of some of our.
In my experience, I'm overly cautious, so I prefer 10 years because you could have something happen in year 2 that you weren't expecting. So it gives you a little more room if you need to say, we need this fire truck a year longer.
Mhm.
But it's really up to the charter commission and the council.
Is that, Tom, do you think 5 years or 10 years is more in line with some of our replacement schedules?
Not the higher dollar value. I would say minimum would be 15 for plow trucks. And it can go as far as 25 for fire apparatus.
My industry, just so you know, we usually typically go to 20 to 30, and that's because we look at roof spans being one of the most major expenses other than asphalt for a community. So that's why we stretch it out that far, is to let them know how much money they need to be saving for their new roofs. Kind of, so it's just, it's.
See, and Nick brings up a great example. So on this fixed asset would be the high school, for instance. It would be shown as a single number. What really matters is the additional investments we need to make, replace roofs and heating and cooling systems and so on and so forth. So there's not a direct line translation from that list to the capital investments we'll need to make. We're not going to replace in kind 1 year the high school. It's going to be maintaining it over time. So I wonder if the next section, it really, begins to speak more to that. I don't doubt that we should be doing this sort of longer range planning. I just think in my mind, it gets cumbersome to be part of the budget submission. And I do worry a bit what assessment of the condition means, quite frankly.
Yeah, and so again, for us, it's anticipated value, life expectancy. So on a roof, we know when it goes in, you get about 25 years, and all of our budgeting from that point and how much they're going to reserve over that period of time is based off of 25 years. Now, we all know anything near the ocean is going to deteriorate faster, so we can kind of flex with that. It's never an exact science, but at least it gives you a ballpark when you go to look how much in condo communities you charge fees, and it's kind of like collecting taxes. I mean, every condo community is its own government, really. And so we set the tax rate, quote unquote, tax rate for that community based on when we anticipate things coming to need, whether it's new roadways or sewer infrastructure.
So is it just a matter of like, if we had the itemized list of the capital somewhere over a certain dollar threshold, just knowing like what the useful life is of when that expires, so that we just know this roof is good until 2060, but some of the other things might need to be replaced as soon as like.
I think it's meant to be what I think the intent is for it to be a visible tool for the community to really understand where we're at. Here's where we're at. Here's what we coming down the pipe. And for the council, how do you budget appropriately? How do you make sure that we don't see? And I think that might be speaking a little bit out of turn, but the underlying sentiment is you never want to get whacked with that big hit, that 15% jump in your tax rate. That's what you try to avoid. So if you can plan ahead, hopefully it's so incremental that you've gotten to the point where those funds are needed for that project when it comes due. And it's a little different because I know government is typically a zero sum type of game. But I think that's the real intent here, and how you get there and what the cutoff is I think a very worthwhile discussion if you pursue these changes. I could understand Tom's concern with coupling budget work alongside of this work. But I would also say that some of that budget work and your vote on a budget you should have that information available as you make your decisions about what's in your budget. So just a thought there. It's not an easy subject.
No, it's not. And it, I want to make sure that I give Tom credit, that big whack, that 15% increase, unless something, tragically unforeseen happened, I wouldn't expect Tom to bring forward a budget that, had 6 different capital improvement projects in it that none of us had ever heard of, or didn't know were coming. We put money in the budget to do the facilities overview. Tom had mentioned that he didn't realize that the floor at the Public Works building, needed to be resurfaced, and that, we want to avoid surprises. And so for me, this is more about how we report that out to the constituents. Like this to me isn't work that's not being done. It's just a matter of reporting. And so is there a way that we can kind of fine tune the wording so that the reporting of it is fixed and expected? And I don't know whether necessarily it needs to be tied to the budget process.
I will say the way we've managed this, for better or worse, I say better, is typically we borrow every year between $4 to $6 million to cover our capital needs. I'm not talking about voter approved large capital investments, and we've got a number looming. And I think history shows that level of capital investment is sufficient to offset what our need is. And in every one of our kind of debt forecasts, we've built in that annual $4 to $6 million borrowing, and we've done it in different increments just to model that. What it's going for is the particular capital investments is what this is speaking to, I suppose. But I'm just saying from a big picture point of view, that's how we've generally been able to manage it, continually to make capital investments. Those are discussed in the context every budget year. The one thing that we do provide is a 5-year capital plan. We provide a lot more detail in the first year of it because that's the one we're seeking funding for. What we could do is to kind of build that out further. We're giving you kind of line of sight into what's coming and a general cost estimate. And as those projects get closer, we kind of tighten up those budget numbers. That to me is a real important part of this because that's what you're seeing coming at you in the next, in the foreseeable future, and we need to plan for. If I had to speculate, given where these suggestions came from, and I think the committee kind of jumped right on and agreed with the sentiment. What I think is historically been the most area of interest and concern is really the large items, and just having a sense of what's coming at us. How can we be mindful and thoughtful and strategic in how we time those projects? So it doesn't have this big, huge jump in tax rate, for instance.
Don, do you want to offer some comments?
Yeah,
That would be great.
thank you. Yeah, I understand that, the conversation about this, but I think that this particular item got here because there was a desire from the part of the public to have more detail. So the dialogue around how easy is it to analyze and how convenient is it for staff to do that, this is less of a concern for me than it is to, I think the intent behind this was to try to get better line of sight for capital investments, including the corresponding operating plans. And even this year, we really struggled with that. I think community services is a good example. I think the library is a good example of that. We have one or the other, or in some cases, neither. So I think that, talking about the timing of the thing rather than the specificity that's proposed here, I think are 2 different things. And for my money, we're trying to reflect the wishes of the public here, not necessarily, either the council or staff. So,
Sure. Don, can I ask you a question about specificity?
Yeah.
So for you, I know that sometimes on the council, we get our quarterly statement or our monthly statement, and we've said it's just, frankly, it's just not useful because it's just a list of expenditures and.
Right.
And
We're just way too much
it's just
detail.
way too much. So do you kind of have, I guess I'm trying to figure out like how to structure this so that it's the right level of information.
Well, for me, at some level, it's binary. Either it's there or it's not. Okay. If it's not there, not acceptable. Okay. If it's there, then it's a question about how much detail we really need. Too much detail is not good for anybody. But being able to get your arm around the total expense, total cost, not just capital, but also not just capital and the debt service, but also the operating costs associated with that, I think is important. So,
Do
so, you know.
Do you have an insight into a threshold that you think makes sense?
You know,
or
I
is
think
it-
that's
Or is
not a
that
big,
the wrong way to go?
I think that's, that's a start. I think the things listed here are not, are not onerous. I agree with what they're saying, get down to such a small level that it, is painful. That doesn't make sense either. But in some cases, you have to take an example of a lease appropriation for, for the hub. Okay, that's, below a certain number based on one term, but it gets to be $1 million on another term, but then without any sort of corresponding detail of the operating expenses to go with making that capital investment, the lease investment, then that's a disconnect. So I think it's, if you don't have some level of detail here, that you're requesting, I think we'll be at the same place that we are now.
Throw out
Thank you, Don.
a recommendation,
Sure, John.
just to throw out a recommendation.
Sure.
I don't know if this is right or not, but
Sure.
like I feel like I like the idea of to respond to what Don said. Like the committee worked on this. They felt like there was missing information. I'm fine trying to figure out how we bring something to the voters that meets that intent. I do think we should set a threshold, right? So what's the right threshold? Because we don't want to report on every little thing. I don't know if 50,000 is even too low, because I do think, like you said, the real interest is in those big areas of capital that require significant expenditures down the road. I think if we could identify the threshold and even just know what the replacement timeframe is for that particular piece of capital, is it 5 years? I mean, maybe it's even just a range of like 5, 10, 15, 20, like within that time frame, right? Because that's probably art and science, right? Probably not exact. So if we could just have a notion of, hey, this isn't 5 years, that means we should see it in our CIP. Anything 10, 15, 20, 25, we're not going to see in the CIP because it's so far out. The one thing that Don said that I think would be interesting, and I don't know from an accounting perspective is if this is simple, but when we do have something in there that does require maintenance to maintain, like how are we looking at the overall maintenance costs to maintain that piece of capital if we're choosing to go that path instead of replacing? Because again, that's where I think of things like historically, what I think the town unfortunately has done is, because we don't always get approval at the ballot, we're constantly maintaining until finally we're at the point where we do have to actually invest and replace. Like I feel like we're almost there with some of the primary schools where those are at the point where they do need some significant investment either inside the schools or building a new school that, had we had this asset list to look at, every year, we might be able to like see those things earlier and say, yeah, we really do need to start saving money or doing something because we know we have these big expenses coming. So I think having the visibility is helpful. And I'd be supportive of something where we can set the right threshold, but also give Tom a little bit more, or whoever's the town manager, a little bit more specifics in terms of what they need to provide so that it's clearer, so that it's less up to interpretation.
This is so challenging because, to Tom's point, like the school buildings are going to come in as a single asset. But what we're actually curious about is how soon are we going to replace the boilers? How soon are we going to replace the roof? Does the parking lot need to be repaved? Like, what is the sum total of investments that we're going to put into this asset in the next 5 years? And so to that point, $50,000 threshold is probably too low. Like, so I don't know how to break this down like reasonably and report out on it in a way that gives the public more insight into what future investments we need to make, but at the same time is somehow going to be part of the budget process. Because for me, this is just become, this gets very
Yeah.
big, very fast.
One thought here, and this has just triggered an idea based upon what the last two conversations from April and also from John. But we have some levels of authority, levels of approval. I mean, maybe that's a guideline. I know we have that at least in terms of when we decide to go to bidding process, that sort of thing. I recall that when Larissa was here, we raised the levels of authority for people in terms of approval levels. You're talking about even in the charter, raising the approval levels overall for spending decisions to go to the voters from 400,000 to 700,000. I support that actually. The numbers we're dealing with are bigger. So I would say, look to things like that might give us some idea, of how to set those numbers. I don't want to set it too horribly low where it just drives everybody crazy and brings the machinery of the town to a halt. On the other hand, I think there's some point in between that and the big capital numbers.
Nick,
Sorry.
thank you, Don.
And I think also too, my first reaction is your department heads should know what their buildings are looking like or what their assets look like and how much longer they have left on them. If they don't, I find that problematic. They should have some concept of where things are going to go wrong in their own departments. So having them put it to writing is again a time-consuming task. Ask them to pull out a crystal ball might be a time-consuming task. There are specialists that do this. There are engineers that evaluate this. I'm not proposing that maybe that's what's required, but there is help out there if department heads need that type of stuff. So I would hope your department's heads would have at least a grasp of what assets they have under them and their longevity and their anticipated cost of replacement in general. So asking them to put pen to paper shouldn't be terrible. Now, I agree, threshold is key. I mean, start with 100,000 and maybe you'll ask how many assets you have in town that are over $100,000 to see how long that list is. I don't know, start there. And then if that's a really, really long list, maybe you pare that down further. I don't know.
To his point, I do agree. What we could do a trial and error and report to the finance committee. This is what's over $100,000. This is what's over $50,000. If you want to see what those assets are, I don't know if that'll help you make a better decision, but that would not be hard to pull those assets for you right now. I can't snap my fingers and get it, but I could if that would help you make a decision.
It seems like the more complicated ones are the facilities.
Yeah.
Assets, right? Like
Absolutely.
what
Yeah,
what
they
you
have
mentioned,
pieces and
I would
pieces.
totally expect, and I think we have a lot of that, right? That comes in through the budget, through the justification, through the CIP, where they're putting in what they need to replace, in my opinion. And they probably, to your point, also know like what's beyond the CIP that they are keeping track of. So I think that's easily, I think the real challenge is the facilities piece. And I know we had deferred funding that facilities study, right? Because I feel like ideally for this to include facilities, that would essentially establish our baseline if we were to move forward with that. And so I feel like we're kind of, I think the facilities is the tricky part to what you said, that I'm wondering, like, is there a way we can frame this similar to what we did, one of the things to start in a future year after we've done that facility study, or somehow think about how this doesn't include facilities until we've done that facility study.
Well, so to that point, John, to get back to kind of the root of where this came from and what we need to be doing as a finance committee is we need to decide if we can fine tune this language to be able to make a recommendation to the full council that says, yes, the finance committee had this discussion. We are open to the addition of this into the charter, and this is the language that we would recommend. And so, and because we all agree, this can't go to the voters without a more clear explanation of what we're expecting. And then once that language is more defined, then we can have finance committee meetings all through the fall and into the winter about what exactly the implementation of that
Mhm.
looks like. And so I think we need to have some autonomy with what that implementation looks like for sure, especially if it passes at voter approval. But we need to decide as a finance committee, is this something that we want to recommend to the full council? And can we agree on language recommendations that make sense? Because the next time my understanding is the next time the full council discusses this, it's going to be an up-down vote on whether or not to put this out to the voters.
Yep.
Mhm.
And this is where I fall short, because at this point, I don't have a problem with it in concept. You know, I think that with some fine tuning between the finance committee and staff, we could probably come up with a pretty good reporting system to address the concerns, but I don't know how to word that into the charter so that we can put it out to the voters.
So if I may,
Yeah, go for
I
it.
think one of the traps we fell into, and when we go through this and read it and then watch you struggle with what we've done, one of the traps we fell into, and I caution the council from doing this, is trying to work within the framework of what's given you. So you
Yeah.
try to add a line in here because you think it fits best there. Sometimes you just need to scrap the sections and write it as maybe with best intent. And I think that's where we kind of fell down a little, which is we tried to keep the framework and
Sure.
squeeze things in where maybe they didn't exactly fit, rather than just say, strike this section, we want it to read this way. So maybe that helps too, because once you get a clear idea of what we were really getting at, it should be okay. We should be able to craft some language that would get you there. Threshold or not for you guys to decide.
I think that it sounds like the struggle is a bit fundamental. I mean, the town charter is really our local constitution. It's kind of intentionally broad. It grants basic powers and duties. The most specific section, I think the petition initiative section is pretty specific, largely due to state law, is really this budget section. It goes through a fairly comprehensive list, whereas most of the rest of the document, in my view, is fairly high level, kind of broad brush. And so I think where I'm getting caught up is just this level of specificity and just making sure that there's a clear understanding of what the expectation is here, so I can comply with it.
I don't think I've veiled my similar sentiments in terms of philosophy, trying to shepherd good work here, but I think ultimately when it's time to discuss this at the council level, I'm not sure that I think that this level of specificity belongs in the charter. But I just want to make sure that as a committee, we bring forward a recommendation or we don't. And so that's where I'm stuck. John, Ken, do you have comments? Been awfully quiet, uncharacteristically quiet today, Ken.
Oh, I'm just listening. No, I tell you but what I'm hearing, I want to make, I getting confused a little bit here, because I thought this was capital, so operational shouldn't be involved. And I agree with Tom that we do have a CIP. And maybe what we do is we reclassify certain groupings of assets and lower the threshold, so those can be included. Example, in the week I was out, I think you voted on 3 new police cars. Okay, that was something that was known, that might not have been in the CIP, but I think it could be captured on the CIP if we could come up with a threshold. But it's capital assets, not operational.
Correct.
That's my 2 cents.
So again, maybe rather than trying to make it perfect, right, we can propose something that's slightly imperfect, meets the intent, and then through finance committee work, we can get it closer through policy of what we're looking for.
Yeah, and one of our goals for, the summer and early fall is to go ahead and tackle the finance policy.
Mhm.
And we had said we wanted to do that. And so that was kind of my inclination. And then, Nick brought us back around and said, no, this was really important, to frame this with the charter in mind. And so I've been really trying to not revert back to wanting to put things into policy
Mhm.
or, even just to refine things at the committee level. So, for me, this is.
So can I throw out to embrace what Nick said about like ignore what we have
Yep.
and just throw out something.
Yes.
So what I would, like, how is this as something for discussion? So it would say an exact statement of the financial condition of the town, which shall include a capital asset inventory list that includes the estimated replacement schedule for assets over $100,000. So at least we're getting a list of assets when they're getting replaced for anything over $100,000. So it gives us more line of sight and visibility. All we're really asking for is that list plus when we expect it to get replaced.
It's a good start.
And at least that's much more easier, at least for the voters. I think that maybe it needs some more wordsmithing to make it less wordy, but like really it's anything over 100,000. We just want a list and we want to know when it's getting replaced. And then that at least
In a
gives,
nutshell, it's pretty good.
Right?
Right. And then you feel you have some flexibility to ask for more detail from departments or
Mhm.
Tom or
Mhm.
whoever. But it's a good starting point.
Yeah, and at least it's within line with what they have. And hopefully, Tom, for you, it's like
That's
a little bit more clear of what.
it's a little more
what we need.
manageable. Yeah. I'm not sure what it's going to give you. It's going to maybe provoke some other questions. And if that's the result, then hopefully it's successful. I don't think anyone is in disagreement that we need to do better capital planning. It's just a matter of where that directive exists and how we're able to bring it forward.
Mhm.
You know, for my purposes, this itemized list of capital investments recommended for the next 5 years, I know exactly what that is. And that's the stuff near term that we really need to be focused on. That makes perfect sense to me, and that's an easy lift. And I think that should be in. It's just that top one that's just, I think John's suggested language provides a little
Mhm.
comfort and it limits the list.
I almost feel like they build on each other, right? Because the first one is like the long list.
Yep.
And then the second one is just the things that need to be replaced or need some
Yep.
investment in the next 5 years. Which might be a little bit more inclusive because it's including other things under the $100,000 threshold, but it's
Correct.
still at least going from here to here.
I think there's two things. It's the visibility as to what the projects are, and two, having it housed in a specific spot that's easily accessible. Because these lists, I gotta believe exist, but they're
Sure.
probably buried in different stacks of paper
Mhm.
somewhere. So how do you get it all in one spot and have it accessible to the public? I think that's the big ask.
Mhm.
If you can check that box, I think you'll escape another 3 days in this.
Yeah.
John, would you just restate that? Sure.
Hold on. I do want him to do that. Can I ask a process question before? So, you know, if we as a finance committee, if John's able to make a motion that the finance committee can recommend to the full council, does that language, will that language be vetted through legal before it goes to the full council, just so that we're not spinning our wheels when it goes to the full council?
It will have to.
Okay.
We need legal review for all ballot questions. So yes, I'll have that.
All right. Great, thank
Yep.
you.
And I don't know if this makes it easier, but along simplifying it, you have a bunch of kind of red line changes in 502.12. Maybe that sentence and the rest of the 502.1 should just be what John had stated. 502.11, kind of summarizing what John had proposed. And then clean up 501.2 to almost read exactly as it did, minus the whole gifts thing, which is another discussion
Mhm.
after this. So, but I think then you're back to where the charter was, minus the gifts part, discussed soon, I suppose.
So are you suggesting 502.1.1 would be my language plus and an itemized list of?
No, your language,
Okay.
an exact statement of the financial condition of the town, then your statement, and that would be,
To replace the language there.
correct.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you can even take out an itemized list of capital investments on 501.2,
Because it's redundant.
because it's redundant at that point. And then you're back to original charter language minus the contribution area.
Mhm.
I personally think that's a good one. I supply you a 5-year CIP. There's nowhere that requirement, well, I suppose the financial policy speaks to it. I'm not sure if it directs me as to how long the CIP needs to be for. So I'm not opposed to you leaving that in. I think having that
Yeah.
codified is probably really important.
Mhm. I like that codified too, because again, the way I interpreted that is like, the first part is the really big list of everything over 100K.
Mhm.
And this is very specific to the 5-year CIP itemized list.
I think if we could take a big step back, we'd craft a whole new section in this 502 that talked about capital planning, because the first one really that's very specific. We're going to tell you the exact financial condition based on the fiscal year. And then we're introducing this 30-year view into the same thought. So it's not perfectly placed, but
So to that point, Tom, do you feel like maybe the recommendation of the finance committee is to let you and staff take a crack at reworking this section? And then that would be what comes before the full council, rather than us trying to sit here and wordsmith it in real time? 'Cause we all
yeah,
know how that
if you
goes.
task me with that, I would come up with a new section that probably pulled in both those two pieces. It would be dealing with capital planning. Just to kind of,
You know,
make it a
using
little
this
simpler.
conversation as the basis for, you know,
sure.
wording. And
So it's almost like instead of having 502, the red line changes you have there would be like a 502 1.x that could just be.
Yeah, I don't know if
specific to
it'll be
capital.
3 or 4, we'll renumber, but yeah, it would be its own individual subsection
I think
that deals with
makes
capital
sense.
planning.
yeah, I'm comfortable with that.
Do you want me to read the language that I wrote, just in case you want to incorporate?
Yes,
something like
please.
that? So I said, which shall include a capital asset list.
Hold on. We've got a tape, so.
You can watch me on repeat over. Oh, I can email it. Yeah, let me email it. I'll read it for the public.
Yeah,
and
read
then
it
I'll
for the
send
public one more time.
Which, there we go. Which shall include a capital asset list that includes the estimated replacement schedule for assets over $100,000. So I'll send that
Yep.
over email.
May I make a suggestion?
Yeah, Nick, go for it.
Do you think we could have some assistance on how many items might be over 100,000 before you get
Yeah.
to that number threshold and bring it to council?
Yep, I don't know it off the top of my head, to be honest, but I can certainly get back to you within the week.
Mhm.
If that's okay, I can report to Tom and give
Mhm.
Tom the list.
I
That's
think
perfect.
That would be helpful in making sure that that number is right before you vote.
Yeah.
Yep, and I can, and when we bring this back to full council, you know, we can report those details out to them so that they have an idea of some of the background work that we did to justify our numbers. I think that makes a lot of sense.
I would recommend you take up the last portion of 502 1.2, because that is really a different matter altogether,
Okay.
just some contributions.
Okay, so 502.1.2 reads, the second red section reads, any cash contributions, donations, or gifts to any non-governmental organizations included in the budget shall be broken out and specified as separate line items. The language is straightforward, it's direct, I know exactly what the request is. This is, for me, is just a matter of whether or not it's the recommendation of the full council to go to the voters with this piece. Yeah, Don, comments?
Well, that one counts as, counts as revenue, right? I mean,
No, it's typically expenses. We're supporting someone other than ourselves. Is my understanding of what that,
so this is the town contributions to those things. So-
contributing to non-governmental organizations.
So say, for example, if we authorize $200,000 for the land trust, is that covered by this?
In the context of the budget, yes, it would be. If we ever found ourselves doing that.
So I'd say it ought to be left in that if it's gonna help us flag things. So
Liam,
Yeah, that was the crux of it, was their request to disclose any contributions. I think that just for the public, I think that there were 2 organizations that received donations. One was Project Grace and the other one may have. been
The other one's the Land
Trust.
Trust.
Minimal amounts.
Not too long ago, we would probably support 20 to 25 different agencies, social service and otherwise, to the tune of over $200,000 a year. And we would spend a whole budget review meeting just reviewing those. We thankfully, Colette really corralled that, and we now only have 2 that we support. Shut the spigot off, so to speak.
So I'm in support of leaving that in, and I think where appropriate, if Tom can just incorporate the new language that we discussed today and leave
Yep.
that section in, and we'll present that as one one concise recommendation to the full
And
council.
I'll work with Christie so we can put that 100,000 in context.
Great. Okay. Tom, do you think, would you like us to take formal action on that recommendation?
I wouldn't ask you to until you see the language. I think I have a clear understanding. I think I'll produce something. Again, it's likely to be a separate standalone subsection just to really draw maximum attention to it and not conflate it with other items. But I think I have a firm understanding what your expectation
Okay,
is.
that's fine with me. Good with the committee? Okay. So next section that we were tasked with, 502-1-5 is just a 4-word change, 5-word change. Comments?
Seems pretty straightforward.
We had some grammarians on our activity, I think, that thankfully cleaned up some language.
Okay,
Question though, like it was kind of talked a little bit at the council meeting, like, does that have to go to the voters if it's really just something that's straightforward, or, because again, I just worry about this being a multiple page.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and each of these would need to be separate ballot questions, frankly. I'm just.
for
to make sure that-
context, Tom, the last time the charter was voted on, do you know how many separate referendum questions there were?
10 or so,
Okay,
as I recall.
that seems reasonable.
yeah.
And I think one of them was to make it gender neutral, so it had a lot of touch points, but the attorney ruled that you could do
That can be
that
done
one.
in one fell swoop.
And I was just looking to see if Phil opined on this matter. He did not. I can clarify for him, with him to see if that's de minimis and not requires a separate ballot question.
Okay,
I think a lot of that would be nice when we go to the next
yes.
meeting. So I recall a lot of our conversation, at least last time, I tried to take notes and it didn't seem like there were many that we felt like we wanted to move forward.
Right.
So moving anything forward on this capital one might be the only one so
Mhm.
far, from what I recall from the meeting.
The other opportunity the council has, if it wishes, and some of the more complicated ones, I encourage you to think about. We have an opportunity to provide an explanation to go along with the ballot questions. So just to help inform the voters, it's not intended to sway them one way or another. It's just making sure if there's context or some explanation that might just help the voters be informed in what the issue is in front of them.
Nick, I know you have another commitment that is very important. And so before you dash off, as we talk about section 503, we went round and round on Wednesday night about what the actual, kind of issue that we were trying to tackle was here. And so my understanding is we're trying to switch from what we currently do, which is if the council does not take action on a budget, that the presented budget by the town manager is what moves forward. The charter committee felt that language needed to be changed to reflect that if the council fails to take action, that it would be the previous year's budget that went into effect.
Correct. And the whole concept there is that you're reverting back to a council approved budget, not a manager proposed budget, one that's already been vetted through a council. And that's what you'll operate from, not something that's being proposed to you new and that has not been vetted or pared down or whatever. So again, you hope you never get to that point and there's no dysfunction there and the relationship continues to be strong. But if it ever did falter, at least you were working off of a council approved budget. That was the sentiment behind all of that.
And then when I read in the packet, what I found interesting, at least on the state for education, it seemed like, even though I think it's slightly different, because it was like essentially if the voters voted no, then the school continues to operate under the prior
Last
year
year's
budget.
budget.
Yeah, so it's a little bit more consistent with that too, from keeping the last year as like the baseline year for like if you can't approve something. So I mean, I'm fine recommending that we change it to the prior year approved budget, if that's the recommendation of finance.
Any
I-
other questions for me? I do actually.
No, I wanted to make sure that I had a good basis and that my summation was accurate and you have confirmed that. So thank you very much, Nick, for making time for us and
Good luck.
definitely get to your next big thing.
Appreciate it.
Boys are waiting.
Thanks. Yeah, I would just observe during my 13, going on 14 years here, the only occurrences where this has come into play, it has to do with the validation of the school budget and failure of voter approval. The council, again, during my tenure, has never failed to act on the budget in the stated timeframe, but it's not been approved by the voters in that timeframe. And I think state law prevails in terms of what happens with the school budget in that scenario. And there was a rich discussion at the charter committee, and I think they ended up basically referring back to state law. They didn't want to try to restate, and it doesn't make sense to. So we're really down to what happens for the town side of the budget. And it seems to me the scenario by which that's a problem is an inability or an unwillingness for the council to act on the budget presented to them. Again, it's not happened. I suppose it always could. And I think intentionally the wording of the current language is intended to put some pressure on the council to take action. And you have full authority to do whatever you wish to do with that budget. So there's no one stopping you from paring it down or changing it however you feel is necessary. So I think there's intentionally it's set up to encourage the councils to take action timely.
Just to clarify, the school budget, again, it's the last budget approved by the town council that went to voters for referendum that prevails in the interim. It's not the prior year's validated budget by the voters. So just to clarify.
Say that again?
Yeah.
So the council approves an overall municipal budget of which there's an education component. The education component goes to referendum for approval. If that is not approved by the voters, then in the interim, that budget approved by the council and sent to the voters is what carries in the interim. They're obligated to go back and revise that budget and send another one to the voters. And in the interim, it's always the town council approved budget, theoretically with the BOE endorsement, that prevails in the interim. It does not revert back to the prior year's funding levels as approved by voters.
The way this language is, it contemplates the council not taking action. And so I think by default, it would become the budget of the prior year.
But
So the
that's
council
all,
did take
for
action.
this education budget, that's all statutorily regulated,
Correct,
correct? I
correct.
mean,
And
the
that's what-
charter can't address that.
And the charter committee attempted to stay away from that.
Good,
But that's
right.
what, if you look at the last paragraph there, it says if the voters do not validate the budget by July 1, the work of municipal government continues while the retry process above is finalized or is followed. In the interim, the latest budget approved at a regional school unit budget meeting. So again, it goes on as applied to Scarborough Municipal School Unit. This provision means that until the voters vote to validate a school budget, the most recent school budget adopted by the town council with cost center allocation provided by the Board of Education and submitted to the voters for validation at a referendum becomes the default budget at the start of the new fiscal year.
So clearly and understandably, they didn't want to put language in the charter that would be statutorily inaccurate, but what the language to me now says is that if the council fails to take action,
That was the issue that Councilor Clucci flagged. Again, they're in the scenario
Yes.
that we were talking about, the council's failed to take action. So the council failed to take action, it reverts back to the prior year. The question is, well, the town council never approved a budget to go to voters. So is the council's inaction effectively the approved budget, which then is sent to voters? And if so, then it's really the prior year's education budget, right?
right,
And that's, I think. the
they would
piece that
be
becomes more
reverting, so
problematic.
they would, in effect, they would be reverting back to the prior year's approved budget at referendum, because that would be the last time that the council approved a education budget.
So I think to follow this through, I think the language that need to be incorporated is that in the event of inaction by the council after 60 days, I think that there need to be language that says, and then that subsequent budget is sent to voters for approval. And I think by default, it locks in the prior year's BOE budget levels. And again, the thing that also came in to further muddy the waters and complicate it, the thing that came into it was, what is it that's being carried forward? Because we talked about, I guess one question I had was, we do see revenues oftentimes increase from year to year. So are we also locking into our revenue projections from the prior year, which also hinders the ability to bring down the tax rate? Are we locking into it? I mean, what are the things that are being, which also just, highlights and underscores the importance of having a council to, review the budget in its entirety and make informed decisions.
Yeah, I mean, there's a series of checks and balances here, and I think there's a classic one here. At the end of the day, we have a complicated, expensive business to run, and we need resources to do that. So I think intentionally the past charter commissions and the current charter really sets up a system that requires action. And again, you as a body control what your action is. You can take $10 million out of the budget if you wish. That's not what's in question here. It's just making sure we have finality. And it really gets to be important as things linger on, moving toward tax commitment. So if the council fails to act, the assessor doesn't know how much we need to raise, and therefore can't set the tax rate. And so, again, it's back to the practicality and the urgency associated with committing taxes, setting tax rates, and running the operation.
So I take back what I said.
For me, I mean, I'll just be candid and say that for me, this introduces unintended consequences and overly complicates the inaction of the council. That being said, trying to be a good steward here and appreciate that the charter committee wanted the inaction of the council to not revert to a proposed budget that, could potentially be higher than what the council would approve. I don't know how to arrive at what the charter committee is driving at without all these unintended consequences.
My recollection was that it was more about trying to incentivize the council to act, right? Is what I thought I heard.
I would be curious to hear from
Slow view
Dawn. Sometimes Dawn has a different perspective than what I'm able to wrap my head around.
This one is mind numbing for me too. Very confusing. Yeah, even without the proposal, every year we go through it, I have a hard time keeping it straight. But I think that if I understand what the folks on the charter committee were trying to get at is that they didn't want to have to revert to something that would be higher than if they didn't approve anything. Okay, and they didn't want to follow the school's rules, which are favorable in terms of getting a higher number. They're more favorable and they're clearer. The state statute is more favorable to the schools, understandably, and clearer. And I think that's why it's a state statute. And the rules governing the town, on the other hand, were not as clear. So I think that you have this thing where it's hard to reconcile both of those because it's two sets of rules. So that's why I think why we keep going around and around with this proposal, because I kind of agree with April. I don't see where this really achieves what I understood the desired goal to be of the folks on the charter committee who as a rule, we're maybe a little bit more conservative as a group on some of the things they're recommending. So I don't know, Tom, help me if I have that wrong, but.
No,
Yes.
and the other thing just worth noting, even if in the event that the council doesn't act, presumably at some point it will. I mean, we seem to be thinking of the scenario where there's the budget stonewalled and no action is ever taken. So if we have to survive for a couple of weeks, I don't care what budget I'm working under because it doesn't really matter. If it lingers in a couple of months and we're approaching commitment, I think it does matter. So presumably a council will ultimately pass a budget and set the new spending limit. So I think this is a bit of a, we're concocting a scenario that is very unlikely. And again, the power is vested with the council. You will do what you wish, and if you don't, ultimately you will, I suspect.
So I have a bigger worry than what we've talked about, and that is in the hopefully unlikely and unfortunate event that we are faced with years we haven't seen in a long time in terms of there need to be cuts made to the budget. This would make it very hard to do that. It would make it impossible for you to do that. So then you'd be stuck with a budget that then what do you do? So that's my concern. That is a mountain of stuff to shovel to get through, and I don't know what we do at that point, but I shudder to think about this, the way it's currently written, with or without this adjustment, that is going to be a whole nother program. Hopefully we'll never see the day.
I agree with you, Don, that this tends to be worded and presented to us in a way that presents one kind of doomsday scenario, which is that the town manager would present a budget that was significantly higher than what the council would agree to. The flip side of that same coin is we are approving last year's budget and it's significantly higher than what we can afford. And so there's two different ways to frame the same conversation. And I think it was framed one way, and it's good to recognize that the inverse of that same situation could play out again in this terrible doomsday situation where the council for some reason refuses to take action on the budget.
Yeah, I might suggest both scenarios are fairly unlikely.
Yeah.
Because if
Yes.
you get a rogue manager, you ought to be looking for a new one, and you would be. And you would adopt a budget that meets your needs, whatever that is. So again, the council maintains full control over that piece.
Ken, do you have any comments on this one?
Well, I've always interpreted this as the council has approved the budget. It's gone to the voters have rejected it. Then the council does not act to adjust to put it back to the voters. Hence, it would de facto go back to the original approved town council budget. That's the way I've always interpreted that. And that's what I thought I just heard Liam say is how the Maine State statute is.
Well, that's why the charter committee tried to pull out the language about the school budget portions of that charter revision, because we don't control what happens to the school portions. And so you're exactly right. If the town council puts out a budget to referendum and it fails and then fails to act on that, that same budget goes out to referendum by statute again.
Right.
And if that does not pass in the interim, then the budget that was approved, this was the language that Liam was saying is in the statute, we don't have any say over, is the budget that the school uses to operate from.
Yeah, April's exactly right. My feeling in participating in these conversations and observing it, the feeling was that what they were trying to guard against was a budget that was too high. And I think the committee had a discomfort with, so here is the town manager presents a budget, it's too high, for whatever reason, the council fails to act, and now we're stuck with that budget that's too high. And so they wanted to guard against that by saying, well, if the council doesn't get their stuff together and doesn't take any action, then we're gonna at least have a ceiling on our spending. That was the general feeling. And I think the examples that were brought up and the flip side of that, I think is absolutely accurate. And to the manager's point, we've seen councils take action right out of the gate before, and it can happen very quickly to say, yeah, we're cutting out $2 million, figure it out, and that wasn't, but that was sort of as quick. So I think the concern that they're trying to guard against, I don't think is is realistic. And I think from a, not to side with the manager on this one, but staff works really hard to put together an informed budget that's defensible. And I guess I would think that there'd be a discomfort with, the council just saying, well, we're not going to do anything about it. And now you also need to figure it out. That just seems like a and balance, but
And having sat on the council, if the town manager presents a budget that makes the council that uncomfortable, there's going to be action on that budget. You know, like that's the nature of the process.
Yeah.
John, go ahead.
So I'd like to move that the finance committee recommends that we keep section 503 as it stands today with no changes.
Do we have a second?
I second that.
Great. Any further discussion? Okay, Colette, can you call the roll?
Counselor Anderson.
Yes.
Counselor Johnson,
Yes,
Counselor Seiler,
Yes,
motion passes.
excellent. Thank you, John, for
Mhm.
bringing us home.
Can I- Since I brought us home, can I throw out the
Yes.
recommendation? So I worry that we're gonna also get tasked, or it might be worth a discussion for 907.1, which we didn't get to discuss in the committee meeting. It's kind of relates to financing, so I'm just wondering, do we want to touch it, or since we weren't asked to, would you prefer to wait for the next charter committee meeting?
Well, I don't have section 907-1 in front of me. I don't-
I think Liam can get it up if you give him a moment.
This is the one that basically raises the threshold from $400,000 to $600,000 for things going to referendum. And there's some other language in there.
Sure. Ken, are you on board with a little bit further discussion since it's 5:15? Or do you want to wait until we're asked by the full council to have this discussion?
was this a motion to amend the agenda?
It's a continuation of charter revision discussion. I mean, we can amend the agenda to include a discussion of 907.
I can make a motion and we can vote it. I'm fine if you guys don't want to do it. So I move that we amend the agenda to add a discussion on 907.1 to the charter revisions. Do I get a second?
Second,
Could I read the section first, please?
Can you see it?
I read slow. Yeah, I second that.
right, Colette, could you call the roll?
Counselor Anderson.
Yes.
Counselor Johnson,
Maybe, yes.
Counselor Seiler,
Yes.
motion passes.
All right. So since John brought it up, I'm going to let you lead the initial conversation, John.
So, when I looked at this one, again, I didn't see any major issues or concerns with it. I'm just curious to hear from Tom, maybe in terms of like how this is different other than the number. Like am I missing something when I read this to see that it's?
No, well, the big difference is that it raises the number, but it also includes long-term, the title has changed to long-term financial obligations. So the thought at the committee level was, certainly issuance of bonds are a commitment, but also leases are a commitment. And so they brought in this notion that leases should require the same type of voter approval. And I think that may, in fact, be a very, they may be clairvoyant. It's possible, if not likely, the town would be considering a major long-term lease with huge financial implications. So I think it makes sense to be thinking ahead. And it struck me, and I think I'm the one that suggested they expand this, because in my view, the nature of this was really these long-term obligations of one sort. Call it a lease, call it bond debt, doesn't really matter. We're obligating future taxpayers to pay a bill. So those are the two changes. I will say there's another nuance, but really important change here. The prior language on the second line, I should take a step back. There has been confusion around this current language in the charter. Many thought that it applied simply to the issuance of general obligation bonds. If you look at the language, it says, or the appropriation and expenditure of funds derived solely from municipal revenue sources. Municipal revenue sources is a very broad category. It could be grants, it could be money you raise. So it's the expenditure of anything, regardless of its funding source, above 400. And I think the committee said, well, that's crazy. If we want to raise money over time through the budget process, or we have significant grant funds, we shouldn't have to go to the voters. It's really obligating a future obligation that we're concerned about. So that's an important change. And I think an appropriate change, frankly.
So my only question there, because my understanding when it comes to the long-term lease that you mentioned, like
Mhm.
would there still be a need to take out debt in order to upfront finance that? And then we're just paying it off with different revenues instead of paying with taxpayer raised revenue, we would be paying with TIF revenue. And so really voters would still vote on that. Like there would still need to be debt. But could there be a scenario where we've built up the TIF reserve so much that we can spend $600,000 on something without having to take out debt?
Well, that's where I say removing this or the appropriation of
Yeah.
or expenditure, that in my view extends to TIF funds as well. And I think that could get very cumbersome by sending every expenditure above $400,000 regardless of source.
Yeah, well, and I don't think that that matches the intent either.
So this was really intended to look to the future and to kind of clean things up and really focus on what at least the committee thought the intent of this was, which is, hey, before we make a long-term financial obligation that future taxpayers will be responsible for, we need to get voter approval.
Hey, Tom, would the hub would have fallen under this? The 3-year lease we just tied into, would that have fallen into this, or would that just been within the budget?
It would have been below the threshold under that scenario, but conceptually, that sort of scenario
Would
would apply if it met the other threshold requirements.
Yeah, okay. You're gonna make a motion, John?
I move that we, as a finance committee, recommend 907.1 as amended to the full council for adoption.
I second that.
Any further discussion? No, Colette?
Counselor Anderson,
Yes.
Counselor Johnson,
Yes.
Counselor Seider,
Yes,
motion passed.
thank you. So whether or not they want our opinion on
Yeah.
907, now they have an
They're
official
getting it.
opinion of the committee.
Very industrious. Extra work.
Item 5 is public comment. Do we have anybody online who wishes to make public comment? Seeing none, there's no one in the room. I'll go ahead and close public comment. Item 6 is adjournment. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Discussion?
Second.
Counselor Anderson,
Yes.
Counselor Johnson,
Yes.
Counselor Seider,
Yes,
motion passes.
great. Thank you, everybody.
I'll prepare that language and circulate it just so you see it. If there's anything I've missed, by all means, I think we can do this by friendly amendment. There's no action taken, so we'll bring it to your liking.
I think ultimately that honors the request of the full council, which was to clean that up and to